Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for spending a few minutes with me. I got my 60th anniversary. Yeah, I forgot I had this, dug it out of the camera. I'm like, hey, that is nice. That should keep my coffee nice and hot today, and I won't spill it if I have a tendency to do that from time to time. So breaking out the 60th anniversary First Baptist Key Largo insulated mug here with my coffee and spending a few minutes with you as we continue to look at Matthew's account of the life of Jesus. And really we're at one of the most significant events in history, certainly from the perspective of a Christian, a follower of Christ, somebody whose life is devoted, in my career is devoted to the church and to spreading this message. This moment that Matthew records, that all the gospel writers record, is so important, and that is the crucifixion of Jesus. In the account that Matthew writes, there's not a lot of detail. Yes, we've talked about some of the detail around his arrest and his trials, and even last week some of the things that happened to him that were just horrible. But crucifixion itself, what we know about that isn't because it's so much detailed in the Gospels as it is that we've learned just from history and other things. And it is a particularly awful method that the Romans came up with to execute criminals that Jesus goes under. Matthew's pretty straightforward, and it says in verse 31, after they mocked him, they took off the robe, put on his own clothes, then they led him away to crucify him. And then in verse 33, it says they came to the place of Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, which is a very interesting picture there. And then verse 35, when they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. So there's not a lot of detail. It probably because, unfortunately, for the people like Matthew who lived in the first century, who lived under Roman rule, crucifixion was a normal way that the Romans executed people. It was just normal. In fact, what the Romans would do is to try to make examples out of those they crucified by putting them in a very visible place. This says, as we just read a minute ago, the place called Golgotha, sometimes called Calvary. Both those words translate to this idea, the place of the skull. You can go to Israel today, and there's actually two sites because that's just kind of the way it is. One is a church. Most of the sites there are churches, and it's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And you can go there, and they can see where they believe Jesus was crucified, and then the tomb into which he was laid inside that church. Or you can go to another spot. It's called the Garden Tomb. That's outside, a little bit away from that, where there is a tomb, a traditional tomb. It was an area where people were buried, but one of the reasons that one is often pointed to is because there's a hill beside where the grave is that looks like a skull. In fact, it's named after a famous person. I forget. I want to say Gordon's skull or Gordon's cross is there. He's the one that it's named after, and it's actually pretty much, you can see the marks of the skull in it, the eyes and the nose. It's eroded over time, but it is pretty interesting to stand there and look at that and to think that may have been where Jesus was crucified. This significant event in history at a very public place. It didn't happen in a corner. It didn't happen secluded because of the way the Romans did it. They hung him on a cross for all to see as a warning. This is what you get if you defy Rome. Now we know, as we've talked about the last few weeks, Jesus's crimes weren't defiance of Rome. Jesus wasn't crucified because Pilate said, I don't see any reason why he should be crucified. The reason he was crucified is not because he was taken to be crucified, but because he came to die. He allowed himself. He said, I think John or Luke records it, no one takes my life from me, but I lay it down. Jesus' whole ministry and life led up to this moment where he laid down his life on the cross. And I know we're removed from that. So can I use the word we've sanitized it? Right behind me. I don't know if you can see all of them. I know you can probably see a couple of them. We have 3 crosses hanging on the back of our stage here. You may be wearing an article of jewelry with a cross on it. And it's a remarkable thing. I say we've sanitized it because it was an instrument of execution. It was a horrible thing. In fact, we have a word in English when you're in excruciating pain, kind of the worst pain you can imagine. If you break that down, some of the roots go back to the Latin ex crucio, out of the cross. Even that word for pain ties back to the method of execution that Jesus underwent a couple of thousand years ago. We've sanitized it, as I said, but that is why I wanted to read this. I guess you'd call it a poem. It's not really poetic. It's not really rhymey poetic, but it's sort of poetic in the way it was written by a Scotsman by the name of George MacLeod. I actually didn't know a lot about him. I had heard this some time ago, and I like this a lot because it talks about the cross, and it tries to unsanitize. It tries to remind us of really how crude and cruel it was. Maybe like we've sanitized the birth in the manger, we've sanitized the cross, and that maybe to our detriment. We need to remember some of these things that George MacLeod wrote. Here, let me just read it for you. I like this. He says this: I simply argue that the cross be raised again at the center of the marketplace as well as on the steeple of the church. I am recovering the claim that Jesus was not crucified in a cathedral between two candles, but on a cross between two thieves, on a town garbage heap, at a crossroads of politics so cosmopolitan they had to write his title in Hebrew and in Latin and in Greek, at the kind of place where cynics talk smut, where thieves curse and soldiers gamble, because that is where he died, and that is what he died about. And that is where Christ's own ought to be. And that is what church people ought to be about. It is a convicting poem. One, because it reminds me of what Jesus did to provide salvation for all who would believe in him. It reminds me of the cost that was paid, that it wasn't nice and sanitized and hung on a wall or in a gold chain around a neck or in an ear. It was a horrible way for him to be executed. And he did it, as we talked about last week, because of his great love for humanity. God demonstrated his love for us in this, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. It's the ultimate expression of the worthy dying for the unworthy, the innocent laying his life down for me who was guilty. And through faith in him, I receive, to my credit, all of his innocence and all of the forgiveness and hope of heaven that he brings to bear. And the other thing I like about this is that it reminds us that no one is beyond the reach of the grace and love and mercy of God. It talks about where this happened, between two thieves, where soldiers gambled, where thieves cursed, and where cynics talk smut, where he's mocked as he's there. The soldiers gamble for his clothes. The thief on one side mocking him until the other thief, not recorded in Matthew but in the other of the Gospels, asked Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom. And Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. Even the thief on the cross, rightfully guilty of crimes that led to his execution, was not too far from the grace of God. Neither are you, neither was I. But because of the great grace of God, and because of the price paid, because of the willingness and the obedience of Jesus to go to that cross that Matthew records for us, that Matthew, a tax collector who understood what it meant to be hated by people, to be unworthy, to be an outcast, now received as a follower of Jesus and one of the earliest leaders of the church, one of the first to go out to carry the message of the gospel of the kingdom to that first century world. That it's him and the others like him that we stand on their shoulders 2,000 years later, because the message has continued to go, because people have taken that message, not just in churches, but into all parts of the world to let people know, into the marketplace, into the neighborhoods, wherever we find ourselves, to let people know of the great sacrifice Jesus made for our salvation. As I've said many times when we have these few moments together, that's what we're about as a church, is letting as many people know of the love of God that he expressed so beautifully through the cross. And we'd love you to learn more, to learn alongside of us what it means to be a follower of Jesus, to mature, to grow, to all sorts of words we use, to become a disciple of Jesus, to become an apprentice, maybe is a word that's more in our vocabulary, of Jesus, and follow him and become like him and share his grace and love with others. That's what we try to do here as a church, is have that happen. That's what I've spent my life doing. And we invite you, if you'd like to know more, we're here Sunday mornings, 9 a.m. We're talking about Matthew's gospel, not quite chapter 27. We're in chapter 24 right now. And all sorts of times we get together, and maybe on tonight, Wednesday, we have our dinner and time of fellowship and discussion. You might come and just meet some folks. And we invite you to come because we want as many people to know about the great love of God expressed through Jesus on the cross. So I'm going to leave that with you today. I'm going to get back about it. Got some errands to run. Headed up to the big city today. Never fun to drive in Miami, but hey, sometimes you got to do it. Headed up that way. Hope to catch up with you, and certainly would love to see you join us in worship Sundays at 9. Hope you're there. Take care.